Welcome, everyone. I'm Arielle Cates. I'm the Director of Programming at Village Preservation. I'm so glad you're here with us this evening. Just a quick bit about Village Preservation. We have been documenting, celebrating, and fighting for the preservation of Greenwich Village, the East Village, and NoHo since 1980. We work to expand and extend landmark and zoning protections and stop inappropriate development while also encouraging appropriate development in our neighborhoods. We host roughly 75 programs a year, most of which are free and open to the public. Our events are meant to illuminate the cultural and architectural heritage, history, and depth, and the value of preservation in our communities. We are a nonprofit membership-based organization, so your involvement and support mean the world to us. You can learn more at our website, villagepreservation.org, and please consider becoming a member or making a donation if you're able at villagepreservation.org/donate. So just a bit of Zoom protocol. I won't be visible during the talk, but I will be here. So please feel free to use the chat to say hi, tell us where you're joining from, or to raise any issues or thoughts. If you have questions, please use the Q&A function. It just helps me keep track of them. You can do that at any point during the talk, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So I am very delighted to introduce tonight's speaker. Amy Sohn is the New York Times best-selling author of 12 books, including the novels Prospect Park West, Motherland, and The Actress. Her books have been published in 11 languages on 5 continents. In 1995, Amy graduated from Brown University. She has written weekly columns for the Downtown Weekly New York Press and the New York Post, and was a contributing editor at New York Magazine for 6 years. As a freelance journalist, she has written for the New York Times, the New York Times Book Review, Slate, Harper's Bazaar, Elle, Men's Journal, Playboy, and many others. Amy is also a screenplay and television writer, including pilots that she's written for HBO, ABC, and Fox. And tonight, Amy is here to talk to us about her newest book, deliciously titled The Man Who Hated Women: Sex, Censorship, and Civil Liberties in the Gilded Age, which we hope you'll all buy tonight. I'm gonna put the link to that in our chat. And Amy, welcome, and take us away.
Thank you so much, Arielle. Thank you to Village Preservation for having me. It's special to me as a native New Yorker and someone who cares about historic preservation to be speaking to you about the wonderful intersection of sex, censorship, and the village, which I'm sure you may have heard about before, but I'm going to go back a little further than you may tend to think of the village when you think about sex in the village. So this is Emma Goldman. This is the cover image of my book, which I should show. This was taken in 1893 and is a little bit of a cheat because this is her mugshot for being charged with incitement to riot. And she was actually arrested in Philadelphia. So I chose it because she's very young in this picture. She's in her late 20s. And the combination of the hat and the angle and the strange way that they did mugshots back in those days was so evocative to me. And the title of my book is in tension with the subtitle, because although it's called The Man Who Hated Women, it's really a group biography of 8 women who went up against Anthony Comstock from roughly the 1870s to the later iteration of Emma Goldman's activism, 1916. Anthony Comstock died in 1915. And it tells the story of these women who, most of whom were overlooked by history. They were what I call sex radicals. I did not invent that term. There's a great free love historian who's now passed away by the name of Hal Sears, and he coined the phrase sex radicals, which I just love. And these were women who are not as well known as suffragists, some of whom were marginalized by society, some of whom were deep intellectuals and thinkers and writers, and some of whom were abortionists trying to make a living. And what they had in common is that they were all prosecuted under the federal or state Comstock laws. I'll tell you in a sentence what I mean when I say the Comstock law. It was passed in March 1873, and it was an expansion of existing obscenity law related to the male that expanded it to include articles to prevent conception. Anyone who gave this kind of information away or sold this information or sold contraceptives themselves could be criminalized for the first time in New York City. I mean, the first time in United States history, with very, very steep penalties and sentences, the equivalent of about $100,000 today, and at various points, 5 to 10 years of hard labor. After the Comstock law passed in March 1873, many other states, individual states, took it as an example and passed very, very similar state laws restricting things like bringing contraception into the state. Connecticut, famously, which was Anthony Comstock's home state, criminalized the act of trying to prevent conception. And in 1965, in the Supreme Court case Griswold versus Connecticut, Planned Parenthood chose Connecticut as its turf, in part because anti-birth control law in that particular state was so strict. Now, if you've never heard of Anthony Comstock, or you've heard about the Comstock laws, but you don't, having a little technical problem. Ariel, there we go. I'm going to read you a quote about Anthony Comstock that gives you a sense of who he was. This is from a scene in my book that takes place at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893. This is actually the same year that Emma Goldman was arrested in that mugshot. 49 years old during the fair and rounding out his second decade in power, he had red mutton chops covering a scar inflicted by an irate smut dealer who stabbed him in the face. He had enormous shoulders, a big chest, short tree trunk legs, a dome-like forehead, light blue-gray eyes, a broad brow, and the build of a fighter. Walking on the balls of his feet, he was short and stout, resembling a New Englander who eats pie for breakfast, dinner, and supper. He favored starched shirts with bow ties. Beneath his clothes, no matter the weather, he wore red flannel underwear. His shoes, which he bought from a police and fireman supply store, were size 13 heavy-soled boots. While crossing the street in New York one day, he was nearly run over by a mail wagon. He shook his badge at the horse and cried, "Don't you know who I am? I'm Anthony Comstock." A reporter once called his office and asked an assistant whether Comstock had been punched in the face that morning. The answer was concise, probably. So Anthony Comstock moved to New York. Ariel, oh, I'm having this. All right, we're gonna get it. We're gonna get it.
Okay.
He moved to New York in the late 1860s, and he wanted to be a dry goods salesman. He found a lodging house on Pearl Street. This was a drawing I found. It's a little bit earlier. It says at the bottom, 1835. Many Civil War veterans like Anthony, who was born in New Canaan, Connecticut, and raised a strict Congregationalist Christian in the kind of town where everybody knew everybody, and whose mother was a direct descendant of the Puritans, moved to New York in his 20s following his service in the Civil War, wanting to make it as a dry goods salesman. He wanted to own his own grocery store. And if you were a young man coming to New York at that time, you stayed in a lodging house, and they were all over what we now call Fidei. And one of the things about these lodging houses is you lived with a lot of other young men, and these men went out on the town every night. It was called sporting culture. And this was an incredible time to be a young as I wrote in the book, I said to be a young comer, and the copy editor did not like that. So we no longer have the phrase young comer. But it was a great time. There was billiards and boxing, but there were also pretty waiter girls who would steal your wallet and take you upstairs for sex. And there were cigar shops all around this area near Pearl Street, where you could rent a room for the hour at lunch from these very attractive women who sold cigars. And the thoroughfare of the obscene book business, which was thriving in New York at that time, was Nassau Street. Books were peddled openly on the street. When I tell people about this book, they say, well, what was smut in the 1860s? It was really everything you could imagine. It was not as prudish as you might think. Everything from bestiality to group sex. There were new innovations in printing, such as the stereoscopic view, which made for these kind of trick postcards. And I should also add that paper was getting cheaper, and railway mail service was allowing mail to travel faster. So for the first time, you could have kind of like a small work of pornography that you could hide in your pocket or in something else. And this was just a new thing to be able to even have a 3 or 4 inch book. Anyone who's interested in this particular period should read a book called Licentious Gotham by Donna Dennis. This is not far from where the boarding house was. This is Printing House Square near modern day Park Row. And Anthony Comstock, when he became obsessed with vice hunting, which was really as soon as he moved to New York, he was surrounded by these single men who were doing all these prurient things. And he felt very isolated and alone. And he was able to befriend some very important men in the YMCA, including Samuel Colgate, whose last name you may know from your toothpaste tube. It was a new time for the YMCA. It had been founded in 1852. And it was kind of a perfect marriage. The bigwigs were looking for someone to help them root out obscenity. And Anthony Comstock was just furious about the fact that smut was being peddled to him openly on the street. Streetwalkers, there were so many different kinds of prostitution, kind of coded prostitution, but then also women just selling sex on the street. It's a New York that I think many of us today, and I say this as someone who wrote openly about her own sex life for 3 years of her 20s, I would be shocked. I think most of us would be shocked by just how open it all was. So when Anthony Comstock passed the Comstock Law in 1873, which he did with the help of these scions of the YMCA, he also formed a private society called the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice. This was kind of a spin-off of a committee, an anti-vice committee that the YMCA had run. And I put this image in my slideshow because to the left, I believe it's the building, it's one of the buildings to the left of the globe, was 150 Nassau. And the timing isn't quite right, so it may not have looked exactly like this in 1873, but 150 Nassau was the American Tract Building, and this was the headquarters of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, where he was the secretary every year from the 1870s until his death in 1915, and the most visible figure of this society. And it was in part deliberate to locate this anti-vice society literally in the heart of the obscene book trade. Something that came up in another talk that I just did the other day that I wanted to mention is you also had this boom in newspapers. You know, you had sporting press, which were newspapers that were targeted toward single men. I like to say they were kind of like lad mags of the 1990s. They had boxing ads and condom ads and true crime and that kind of thing. But this was also a boom for what we would call today mainstream newspapers. And all the newspaper buildings that you see in this picture, the Tribune, the New York Times, they made a lot of money from abortionist advertising. Oh, I see the building. I got it wrong. The Tract House is really in the center. It's just to the left of the New York Times building. It's interesting when you think about the old gray lady to think that her history is making money off of pages and pages and pages of abortionist ads. Those kinds of ads were not only the province of places like the National Police Gazette and Day's Doings, journals that were targeted toward single men. Okay, I think I'm talking too much, and that's why.
I don't think so.
Okay. I'm pausing so long. So Anthony Comstock, thank you, Aria, comes to New York around 1867 or 1868. And the first women he comes into public conflict with are Victoria Woodhull and her sister, Tennessee Claflin. They had been raised in the Midwest. They were a little bit older than he. And they had been spiritualists, clairvoyants from a very young age. Their father made a lot of money sending them on the road to basically tell people's fortunes and capitalize on this very tragic chapter in American history, which was just the mass casualties of the Civil War and people's desperation to come into contact with dead relatives. These sisters were brash. They were unusual. They were feminists early on, although the phrase that I use in my book is women's writers, RIGHTER, women's rights activists. They, among other things, started a leftist newspaper called Woodhull and Claflin's Weekly on Broad Street, which published the Communist Manifesto, published George Sand, and then it also had all kinds of ads for quack medicine. It was a real mix of highbrow and lowbrow culture. They also founded the first all-women's brokerage house, which was called Woodhull and Claflin's Brokerage. And one detail I loved about this is that they could not actually place trades. They had to do it through a man. A woman was not allowed to have a seat on the stock exchange until 1967. The first house Victoria lived in was 53 Bond Street. I threw this in just to show you can kind of imagine that low scale frame. Her backstory is really quite tragic and sensationalistic. Her first husband married her when she was, I think, 15 3/4. Her parents wanted her to marry this guy. He was a very bad alcoholic. His name was Canning Woodhull, and their son Byron was developmentally disabled. And Victoria believed that this was due to the father's alcoholism, which was a very common belief at the time, that certain characteristics, anything from developmental issues to criminality to poverty, were inheritable. So they tussled with Comstock because in their newspaper, they published two really scandalous stories in November 1872. One was about Henry Ward Beecher and revealed the story that he was having an affair with the wife of Theodore Tilton, one of his proteges, revealing his hypocrisy and the hypocrisy of the church. And the other article that was published in the same issue under Tennessee's byline was about an alleged gang rape that had occurred at a masked ball and involved a teenage girl. It was really horrible, awful story. And it began with this wonderful phrase in which she said that she wanted to bring down powerful men as powerful even as the president of the United States. Well, Comstock got word of this issue and immediately went after the sisters. Some believed that he was paid off by Beecher. They were, of course, traveled in the same social circles. And the sisters had a very drawn out trial. At one point, they were under more bail than Boss Tweed himself. And the reason they were so important to the history of the Comstock Law, aside from the fact that they represented the kind of changing nature of American womanhood, was that the Comstock law included newspapers in its list of obscene articles, and it did that specifically because Tennessee and Victoria had published these articles in a newspaper. So what I say in the book is that the Comstock law was written specifically to go after two really vibrant and controversial symbols of a changing American womanhood. This is the palace of Madame Restel. Anne Trau-Lohman was prosecuted under the state Comstock law for selling articles for a criminal purpose, which was articles to prevent conception, to Comstock himself. He showed up at her door in 1878 at the corner of Fifth Avenue and 52nd Street, using a false name, and bought abortifacients, these pills and powders. Someone wrote me this week to say that when Anne Trau-Lohman, whose sort of abortionist name was Madame Restel, and her husband, Charles Lohman, first practiced, they did it on Greenwich Street and Liberty Street. Both locations are the former World Trade Center. And I think there was some sort of a public art project to memorialize her before 9/11. And that public art project was destroyed. So she started out in the same turf as Comstock, but then became so wealthy that they built this mansion from scratch at 5th and 52nd, specifically to vex St. Patrick's Cathedral, because she heard that they were preaching against her. She had a lot of money and would ride her carriage in Central Park, and very expensive furs. This is New York Illustrated Times is one of these sporting newspapers I mentioned, and this is an imagining of her arrest. I don't think, I mean, the guy with the mustache could not be Anthony Comstock. He doesn't look anything like that. So I'm not sure who he's supposed to be in this picture. But the woman in the veil behind her, the day he came to arrest her and search the house, there was a woman in a veil basically consulting her about a contraception issue. And she said that she was the wife of a prominent merchant. And whoops, there we go. Good?
There we go. Yeah.
So this was her arrest, and the woman in the veil is crying because she's just thinks she's going to be ruined and somehow be taken into this. Madame Restel was taken to the Tombs, Franklin, Leonard, and Center. They were notorious. Charles Dickens wrote about them. She had already been imprisoned at Blackwell's Island several decades earlier. By the time he went after her, she was 67. But a woman had died under her care, and she had already served time at the women's workhouse on Blackwell's Island, and believed that she was going to die in prison. This is her in her room in the Tombs. She was taken very good care of. And before I get into that story, I will say that Madame Restel, on the eve of her sentencing, at the age of, I believe it was 67, became so convinced that she was going to die, receive a long sentence and die on Blackwell's Island, that she slit her own throat in the bathtub. The bathwater turned pink, and she was found there by the maid, Maggie McGrath. Anyone who's interested in this chapter of birth control history should read a wonderful book called The Wickedest Woman in New York by Clifford Browder. And there's also a great piece about it by my friend Abbott Kaler, writing under the name Karen Abbott on Smithsonian. And now I'm going to talk about someone that is not as well known as any of the women I've spoken about before. You might have heard of Victoria Woodhull, and you may even have heard of Madame Restel. One of the women in my book is named Sarah Chase. And Dr. Sarah Blakesley Chase was a homeopathic physician, educated at the Cleveland Homeopathic Medical College. She married a fellow homeopath named Hazard Chase. She was born in 1837. They had one child named Grace and separated soon after Grace was born. She said that Sarah said that he had a mistress. And then she became a kind of a suffragist and an advocate of dress reform. Dress reform was a really interesting social movement around the 1860s and 1870s, which posited the idea that women could not be liberated until they were liberated by clothing, that restrictive clothing both prevented them from laboring in ways equal to men and earning money equal to men, and also caused enormous physical problems because of how constricting the dresses were. Sarah she preached something, when I say preach, I mean, she spoke often in churches about sex education. And it was one of the code words for it was physiology. And in the 1870s, she and Grace moved to New York. And this is 111 West 11th Street, where we think that she sold contraceptives, opened up this practice selling contraceptives. Sarah Chase swore that she never, ever provided abortions. I will explain that a little bit later. I believe her. You may, if you read my book, come to a different conclusion. But her story came slightly after Madame Restel's. It was about a month after Madame Restel had committed suicide, which was on April Fool's Day, 1878. It was May 1878. And Sarah, too, was decoyed by this man claiming to be Mr. Farnsworth, who turned out to be Anthony Comstock, and he wanted to buy a vaginal syringe. And what vaginal syringes were, I'm going to just go out there and say this is the first village preservation talk to include the phrase vaginal syringe. And I'm very
into it.
I'm so happy to have that honor here. Vaginal syringes were essentially douching syringes. They were very cheap and easily available because they could also be used for health and hygiene, commonly recommended. Every woman was supposed to have a syringe, but they could be used after intercourse to flush out semen. And women douched with everything from water to various astringents and herbs and all kinds of things that were said to have spermicidal qualities. They were somewhat effective. There was one study that women in the 19th century who douched had children spaced twice as far apart as women who did not. So Sarah started a medical journal with her friend Samuel Preston, and it was called The Physiologist and Family Physician. She didn't only sell contraceptives, she spoke at places like the Packer Institute, which happens to be one of my alma maters, and the Williamsburg Lyceum, to separate groups of men and women about sex. One of her famous talks was called The Secret Vice, and that was a talk for men only about masturbation. Masturbation was known as the secret vice because it was said to lead to so many physical and other problems, including insanity. So after Anthony Comstock arrested her, her case was dismissed. But she was furious and really felt that she had been wronged because he tricked her into selling a syringe. And she swore that she was anti-abortion and just sold them as hygienic. And so in her journal, The Physiologist and Family Physician, shortly after her arrest, she and her colleague, Mr. Preston, started advertising the Comstock syringe. They literally named a vaginal douche after Comstock. And they ran many notices like this. You can see the price was $10.
No, sorry.
On the lower left for months. I think it was actually a period of about 3 years, from around the spring of 1878 to the spring of 1881. And he was furious. Sarah actually was able to, she was so upset about her arrest that she filed a damages suit against him for $10,000. Just think about that. In 1878, a middle-aged woman and a single mother, filing a suit against one of the most powerful men in the United States. And he was actually arrested by a sheriff. But although she pursued the case for several years, it never went anywhere. I think she ran out of money to pursue it. And of course, he also had so many friends in high places that it was, he was not going to serve a sentence. But she did succeed in having him arrested. This is Ida Craddock. She's my favorite person in the book. When I start to tell you about her, you'll think this is a Philadelphia story. I also have family connections in Philadelphia, so there's so many reasons I feel drawn to her. And the book is dedicated to my grandmother, who was born in Philadelphia. Ida Craddock was born in 1857 to a cannabis salesman and his wife. His wife, Lizzie Craddock, was in the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And I'm a little unclear on the religious trajectory, but they were sometimes Quaker and sometimes Unitarian. Ida went to a very prestigious school that you may have heard of called Friends Central. She excelled there. She was absolutely at the top of her class. And when she was in her early 20s, she wanted to be the first woman to get an undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania. And she took the exams and passed with flying colors, but was not admitted because she was a woman. Like many people who are frustrated achieving their goals due to social limitations, she turned to sex writing. And she lived in her mother's living room behind a partition that she called the cubicle, and spent all of her time. She tried to get into Penn 3 times. They rejected her over a period of about 3 years. It was decades later that women were able to enter the undergraduate program. She decided to spend all her time at the Ridgeway Library, and she was able to read some books about sex. Then she went off to California to try to get away from her mother because they had kind of a mommy dearest type of relationship. Ida always wanted to have these intellectual salons in her mother's home on Race Street, and her mother didn't want to. And so they would fight constantly about this. So she did this. Her story feels so modern to me. She goes off to California. Like I know so many people in my 20s that had this trajectory, lived in San Francisco, had a series of kind of odd jobs, felt very frustrated by her ability to make a living, and believed that had she had a college education, she would not be impoverished. Met a man who took her on a trip to Alaska, was a platonic, this was a boss, and became obsessed with totem poles and phallic symbols. Returned to the United States and started pitching herself as an expert on phallic worship. And she went to the Chicago World's Fair. The opening of my book is both Ida and Anthony at the Chicago World's Fair. I know I'm getting to why you're looking at East 15th Street. And she became totally intoxicated by the belly dancers. And so this kind of combination of going to Alaska and becoming interested in phallic worship, and then seeing the belly dancers and feeling that she understood this fusion of sex and symbolism, made her decide to pitch herself as this sexpert, basically. And she was using the word sexologist to describe herself as early as the 1890s. That term with a hyphen in it, sex hyphenologist. I think the earliest reference I was able to find for it was even like the 1860s. So it's a much older term than we like to think. So the first talk she booked was at the German Masonic Temple. And I believe this is the location of it. And it was absolutely scandalous. It was written up in the New York World. And I mean, I would just love to have known what she said, but she probably talked about belly dancing basically being a demonstration of how women should behave during sex, which was to move their hips. This is 134 West 23rd Street. And I guess I'm going to have to give a little bit away. Ida Craddock wound up writing all of these marriage manuals. She lived in Denver, she lived in Chicago, she lived in Philadelphia, she lived in DC, and eventually she lived in New York. She practiced in apartment number 5. So we're looking at the one to the left of the Peloton. And she saw sex clients. She would teach them basically a way of channeling their orgasms out of their head, which was known as male continence. And this was a very important and common birth control technique that was advocated by free lovers. They believed that this withholding of ejaculation led to a deeper connection between the partners, but they were also surely aware that it was a form of contraception, that if men were not ejaculating inside women, there were likely to be fewer pregnancies. By the time Ida Craddock moved to New York in 1901, Comstock had already written about her in his arrest logbook, and he was aware of her arrests in other cities. She had never served a prison sentence, but she had been institutionalized by her mother outside of Philadelphia. And when she moved to New York, my take on it is she really wanted a showdown with him. She knew that this was Anthony Comstock's turf. And she had no resolution. She had been charged and she'd met all these postal inspectors in all these different cities. Incidentally, in Chicago, she was defended pro bono by Clarence Darrow, who was the same age as she and in a very radical phase of his own life. This was before he became known for the Scopes monkey trial. But Clarence Darrow told her to take a plea. Like, this woman could not get a break. She gets Clarence Darrow as her lawyer, and he's like, take a plea. So she did. She received a suspended sentence in Chicago. And by the time she moved to New York, I think she wanted Anthony Comstock to come after him. The reason I think that is because she sent him all of her marriage manuals. By that point, she had published about 4 or 5 of them. And she sent them to him with a letter that said, please tell me if these are obscene. So he knew she was in New York. And without going into all the details, because I do hope you read them in the book, he wound up getting her prosecuted in both federal and state court. She served 3 months in the women's workhouse on the state charges, then wrote an expose about the prison conditions for women. And when she got out, her federal trial proceeded in something called the Court of Special Sessions, which was a panel of 3 judges. She was not allowed to read from her book, The Wedding Night, which had been indicted. And just like Madame Restel believed that she was going to have a very, very long sentence. She got word, some rumor got to her that one of the judges was going to give her this long sentence. And so at the age of 44 years old, in this building we're looking at, 134 West 23rd Street, certain that she was going to receive a sentence, and if not die in prison, become very ill in prison, which she had already, she knew what prison was like. She wrote a whole bunch of letters, one to Anthony Comstock, one to her mother. She loved her Remington typewriter. She took it with her everywhere. And she either slit her wrists or drank lamp oil, some combination. And her mother found her the next morning. They were supposed to go to breakfast before going to the court. She was another tragedy of the Comstock law. And she's just an absolutely fascinating figure. I can't believe I've said this much about her and not mentioned that she claimed that all of her sexual knowledge was from a ghost named Soph, who visited her at night and gave her usually mind-blowing sex, but it wasn't always good. To which I say, if you're going to have sex with a ghost, shouldn't he be great in bed every time? But you just can't count on men, living or dead. This is Anthony Comstock in his office at 150 Nassau Street. You can see by the color of his, someone maybe will correct me if these are mutton chops. These are actually technically mutton chops. But you can see he's a little older in this picture. And I put this in here because this is around what he would have looked like around the time that he met Ida Craddock. Gives you a real sense of his, what I call monomania. So I know you all know a lot about Emma Goldman. we're gonna just blow through the Emma Goldman chapter. There's just so much to say about her, but she's, although mainly known for her labor activism and anarchism, she was really the one who introduced the idea of birth control as a political movement to Margaret Sanger. I like to say that she was the Bernie to Margaret's Hillary. And Margaret Sanger began as a socialist, but later became less and less involved with the Socialist Party and became convinced that birth control had to be a single issue. Emma Goldman clashed with Anthony Comstock almost immediately around the time within a few years of founding Mother Earth. This is, what did we say, Iris? This is second in St. Mark's. And the Cafe Boulevard had this thing called the Sunrise Club. It was a leftist kind of intellectual club, and she spoke there very often. And when Emma would speak there, they would get more attendees than at any other event. And I believe this is very close. I know this is very close to Village Preservation's office. It was at a meeting of the Sunrise Club that she shouted down Anthony Comstock. Oh no, I'm sorry, that was a different meeting. But she hated him from the beginning. She wrote an essay about what was then called the white slave traffic or prostitution, in which she called out hypocrisy of Puritanism, and they banned issues of Mother Earth. And then, of course, later she was prosecuted for distributing birth control information, which she said that she never did. Margaret Sanger had a column for the New York Call that started a few months before February 1913. And in one of them, she described in great detail what happened to a woman who is syphilitic. And the issue was banned by the post office. And so the next week, in the space of her regular column, this is what they ran: what every girl should know, nothing. Margaret Sanger's husband, some people don't know this, was also prosecuted under the Comstock law, Bill Sanger. She had a contentious, difficult, strained marriage with him. Beyond the first couple of years of it, she wanted an open marriage and he didn't. She had one anyway. He would not give her a divorce. She had to wait, I believe, 6 years in order to get a divorce. And this is a cartoon from the Masses. There's amazing archives online of all of the issues of the Masses magazine, which was this leftist journal published around this time that I'm interested in, when Emma Goldman and Margaret Sanger met, 1910s. They had a wonderful, wonderful political cartoonist by the name of Robert Minor who did this. And this was the same month that Bill Sanger was going to be, that his case was coming up. He sold Anthony Comstock a pamphlet called Family Limitation and was prosecuted for that. Robert Minor did this cartoon, and the caption, I know, is hard to read. It says, "Your Honor, this woman gave birth to a naked child." And this is kind of the iconic, absolutely iconic image of Comstock at the end of his career. You can see how white his hair is. A time when major American magazines were running stories on birth control, and the political tide was really beginning to shift, and people who were against birth control were seen as kind of out of step, not so much with sexual liberation, but the idea that families should be able to make these choices for themselves. In the same way that Anthony Comstock moved to New York in the late 1860s and found a city that was really targeted towards single men, when Margaret Sanger and Bill Sanger moved to New York around 1911 or so, there was a city that was more open to and sort of interested in the idea of single women. And for the first time, really, since the 1890s and the birth of Coney Island, you really had men and women interacting in ways that we would call dating, or was called pleasure seeking back then. having peer relationships and spending time together. Whereas in the 1860s, when Anthony Comstock came to New York, women were really commodified for sex. And there's even one estimate that as many as 10% of women in their 20s prostituted themselves at the time that Anthony Comstock first came to New York. I want to end on this image. That's Emma Goldman speaking in the back of a touring car in Union Square about birth control. Ariella and I were looking at this before the talk and just noticing how many men appear to be in the crowd, judging by the hats. All these men wanted to know about birth control. And Emma was charged after this with distributing birth control information. She did not. She defended herself, but she did serve in the Queens Penitentiary. And we all know the way that her story ended, which was that ultimately the issue that brought her down was not birth control, which was only one of many political and social issues that she cared about. But she wrote an article in Mother Earth telling men to avoid the draft into World War I. And she wound up being deported. And it's, Ariel, you can stop the slide if you feel like it. I feel very sad about the way that Emma's story ended in comparison to the way that Margaret's ended, because she really gave her this gift. This is the last image in my book. And that's Emma Goldman with her pale blue eyes. She gave Margaret this gift of making her understand birth control as an economic issue. And then Margaret was just the perfect kind of representative of the cause. And with her looks and her palatability and her Americanness, she went and took Emma's ideas and took them on the road. And they had a little bit of a frenemy situation going on where Emma felt that Margaret never properly credited her. And Margaret would give quotes saying things like, well, we all know that Emma Goldman was first and foremost an anarchist. So instead of kind of sticking together, as so often happens, a more radical kind of, I don't want to say complex because Margaret Sanger was very complex too, but a more radical figure kind of, I guess we would use the term, awakens somebody else. And then that person, the second person, is able to be the more visible representative of the cause. Is it progress? Well, we got birth control, but I'm really proud and happy to be able to tell the Emma Goldman chapter of the story in my book. So that's my extemporaneous talk. I apologize for the slide issues. I need to look into updating my system, but I would love to talk to you or anyone about anything. Almost.
Almost anything. Amy, thank you so much. This is such a complete delight. I mean, I have many questions. Isn't there a plaque for Emma on West 11th Street? Do you know?
Yeah,
I'm
thinking, I don't know if the person can chat back, but I'm thinking that was the address of Mother Earth.
Probably. I can check on that though. And we also have a question from Andrew, who's asking about Comstock's psychological profile. What drove his mania? What was he repressing?
This seems to be, I got this question a lot. And isn't it interesting that we look at it through this very almost like Freudian lens, that the only reason someone could hate contraception and abortion is because he was repressed? I mean, we're looking at it through these, oh, we're getting the streets. Okay, this is good. We're looking at it through these very modern eyes. I think that, like many people who are raised religious, some stick with it and it is a part of their life forever, and others turn away from it for various reasons. But at the time that he was in his 20s, there were many, many people like him. and to be raised in a very religious, it wasn't just being raised in a religious community, it was raised in a community where all of your rules for everything came from religion. And then to come to New York and see all of the things that I described, I really believe that he went into some kind of shock. Some people have said that he was like anal retentive. He had very, very good handwriting. We know that his service in the Civil War was not successful. His service was largely peaceful. He followed his brother into the Civil War. He was bullied by the other soldiers because he would dump out his whiskey ration so that none of the other ones could drink it. He basically avoided alcohol from the age of 10 after a bad experience with wine. I don't know. I don't know what turned him into a zealot, but I think what's fascinating is it is a classic example, and I will say this without naming any names, but you need a combination of someone with a real lust for power and a mechanism to get that power. And for him, that was the YMCA. So to me, the tragedy for American women is really the piece of it where he was able to connect with these guys who could help him get this law passed. Otherwise, he would have just been going into dirty bookshops and, fetching a cop and, getting the occasional, store shut down. But he wouldn't have had the impact that he had if he hadn't been able to befriend these men. And the reason he was able to befriend them is because the YMCA was a very nascent organization at that time. And they were like, oh, you want to help us? We need all the help we can get. I should say one other thing that I think a lot of people don't, think of when we think of YMCA and the village people and stuff. It's all coming together, village people, is that the YMCA in New York was founded specifically to address the problem of so many young men coming to New York City and turning to these bawdy delights. That's why they got the idea to build a building so that the young men would not have to live in these boarding houses and play cards and do all these other horrible things, but they could have an alternative, which was intellectual conversation and gymnastics.
I was wondering also, just like, who were the judges? Was Comstock friends with the judges who were putting down these horrible extended?
There were all kinds of rumors, that people were paid off. Of course, he denied all of them. But I think one thing that's really important to remember is that the legal system itself, in many cases, people were tried by judges and not juries, and that's complicated. But you also have to remember these were all men. So I'm writing entirely about women. And I say in my book, the first year a woman could be a federal judge and juries. I mean, we're talking about the 50s and the 60s. And so here they are trying to talk about what their intent is and talking intimately about sex. And then they're explaining it to these men. It must have been absolutely terrifying.
Well, Francie is pointing out that birth control probably was as liberating for men as it was for women, but it seems like that gender parallelism was too much for some folks to embrace.
That's a very good point. I mean, these publications I was talking about, the quote unquote sporting press, they were filled with ads for condoms. A lot of people, when I say, what's your book about 19th century contraception? Was there any? People think that like contraception began with the pill. Some people maybe know that condoms have been around a long time. But if you're really interested in this, you want to look at the changes in rubber related to the expansion of contraception, because Charles Goodyear wrote an essay in which he talked about I think he either called them gonorrhea bags, or as rubber was able to be more flexible and do more things, you actually did have, in a time period that we would not normally associate with it, items that were similar to diaphragms, cervical caps, pessaries, and of course rubber condoms. So I feel like we tend to think of rubber as very modern, but vulcanized rubber was invented in the 1840s. So rubber really helped birth control. And yes, men were aware of men were aware of condoms. I think my understanding is that the earlier condoms were like you could knock on them. It don't seem that much fun for the man.
Deborah wants to know, weren't the Comstock laws on the books for a very long time? When did that?
Yes, thank you for bringing that up. So Comstock laws are very complicated because there was the obscenity portion and the birth control portion. And so I don't really write in this book much about obscenity law because that is a well-trod history of free speech in this country. And there are a couple of really important Supreme Court cases. But in terms of the birth control provisions, Griswold versus Connecticut was considered one of the first major blows. And that was where, in that case, it was decided that a married woman could obtain contraception from her physician. But it was not until 1972, 1 year before I was born, that single women in a different case could obtain contraception from their physicians. And that's just mind-blowing to think how recent that is in our history. And of course, I don't want to talk too much about what's going on today, but if you watch, there's a very interesting conflation of abortion and contraception that's going on right now. And I think that it's that demonizing contraception is a tool for demonizing abortion. And I really believe that in Anthony Comstock's time, he was not alone in not totally understanding the difference. And that's okay. It's confusing. It is confusing. It's also confusing because things like vaginal douching syringes could be used both immediately after intercourse to try to prevent pregnancy. And then some women, when they became pregnant, douche to try to end the pregnancies. So there were various items that could be used for both purposes. My understanding is that's not the case today, but you really want to watch the kind of debate about birth control because you think to yourself, how are we still arguing about this now? And what is arguing about birth control coverage really about? Is this all a proxy toward the eventual overturning of Roe v. Wade? But we cannot get too depressed. So let's get some juicy questions in there.
Yes. Laurel wants to know, did the trial of Mae West overlap with all of this?
That was later. She was tried. She tried under the Comstock law. There's an amazing Village story. I'm going to pivot. There's an amazing Village story about this woman named Clara Tice, Tice, who was known as the Queen of Greenwich Village. And she had a show of erotic engravings at Polly's, which I want to say was on McDougal Street.
It was.
And that was shut down under the Comstock laws. I really wanted to include her in the book. I mean, there were all kinds of people that I wanted to include where the timing wasn't quite right. And I was really staying away from the prosecutions over artistic expression. I was much more interested in women who were essentially birth control advocates.
Mae West was tried in 1927. I'm putting her blog post about it in the chat. Yes. Well, I was very struck by your story about who was having sex with a ghost, and that was how
Ida Craddock.
So incredible. So I'm curious because Village Preservation hosted a talk, I want to say like a year and a half ago or something like this, about like witchcraft and in the village, and women who were reading people's fortunes who were also often sex workers. And I'm curious in this way about like the occult and science. Yes. And the way that they came together.
You are like so okay. Well, first of all, you need to go to a site called IAPSPOP. which is a repository of occult publications. You will have the best time. This was a huge resource for me and is a resource to anyone writing about this time period. There was a lot of intersection between spiritualism and radicalism, and I think that's what you're getting at.
Mm-hmm.
Partly it was because spiritualism was a very woman-led kind of religion. It contrasted with Christianity in that way. Spiritualists were kind of, why am I thinking of, Suzanne Vega saying, I'm always on the fringes, on the outside, or whatever her lyric is. They were, because they were rejecting conventional ideas about religion, they were also very inclined to reject conventional ideas about all sorts of other things, such as a woman's place.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a real problem for Ida Craddock, because she, just so you understand her relationship with this ghost, she didn't walk down the street speaking to someone that you couldn't see. She seems to have had a total ability to distinguish reality from her relationship with this man. He by day, he only came and saw her at night. And so she'd been raised Quaker. She went to Friends Central, and she wanted the approval of the radical world. And then when the radical world found out that she had sex with a ghost every night, they just all thought she was completely crazy. The men were really, really patronizing about it. And they would say to her, come on. You must have gotten your knowledge from an affair. Like they were basically like, we're radicals. Like, just tell us, like, we're okay with premarital sex. Who is he? And she was totally consistent for her entire life that the only knowledge she gained was from this lover who she married in the borderland in the fall of 1892.
Wow.
And who, I should add, was not just she didn't conjure him. Spiritualism was a lot about connecting with people you had lost. He was the ghost of a businessman, an older businessman who was friends with her mother, and who would come to their home in Philadelphia to spend time with her mother. And then when her mother was taking some time doing the laundry or the sewing and this kind of thing, Ida would sit in the drawing room talking to him, and she had a real crush on him, and he died of tuberculosis when he was very young. So yeah, that is absolutely fascinating. William Stead is in my book. He's a really interesting occult figure. He's known for the review of reviews and dying on the Titanic, but he employed Ida Craddock at several different times in London when she was sort of on the run from the law and on the run from her mother. So, and Victoria and Tenny, the question is, they were practicing clairvoyance on people like Cornelius Vanderbilt. So their backstory is more the American huckster story, which was as young children being sent on the road and making money off of, I'm sure on some level, being attractive and charismatic, and then claiming to have these powers. They were also later accused of prostitution. Basically, they just kept getting run out of every town they were in. The Claflin family would get into trouble, have to move someplace else.
I mean, I feel like that is Emma Goldman's story also a little bit, just like trying to settle in a place and not really succeeding. It's so interesting. I mean, I guess on a basic level, I am curious about how the post office is, like, how does the post office get to make these laws?
Yeah. I mean, this is very confusing because we think that speech is constitutionally protected and things like private letters are constitutionally protected, but they weren't. I mean, obscenity was seen as its own category, and you were allowed to search private letters. One of the sadnesses of the Comstock law is that you weren't allowed to explain the intent of your writing. Juries were only allowed to look at the obscene passage in isolation. And what so many of these women were trying to do was
if you even agree that what, they're writing was obscene, if they're explaining a technique like male continence or something like that, they were trying to make life better for women. And so it was impossible to talk about, they didn't want their work to be considered in isolation. They wanted to say this is political speech. And obscenity law was really shady and shifty. And in some cases, the juries were not even allowed to see what the indicted passage was, or it would say like the indicted passage is, and then it would say too obscene to be written here. So it's like they couldn't, in other cases, they would be able to read it in deliberations, but not with the witness in front of them. So postal history is complicated. And I should also say that, I'm fascinated by the mail. Like if someone came up to me at a party and said, let me tell you the history of the Postal Service, I would love it. But
Same.
The reason I think it's really relevant to modern audiences is it is like the internet. The mail was so powerful at this time. The mail was everything. This was the way you got information, was through the mail. And there was this real boom in sexual advice literature in the 1840s that came to an end because of the Comstock laws. If anyone's interested in this, I wrote an article about a book called Fruits of Philosophy, which was an 1840s contraception guide, basically, by an Ashfield, Massachusetts country doctor by the name of Charles Knowlton. And this is on JSTOR if you want to look it up. But I'm fascinated by that pre-Civil War period. And again, a lot of times you could get this information in journals that were like water cure journals. There was a whole subset of radical publishing that was health oriented. And you would read about, diet and horticulture and birth control, which brings us back to what we've all been talking about recently, which is that people who believe in science are often leftist because their rationalism somehow connects to their leftism. And so in these journals, it was not at all unusual for readers to get that, really political content side by side with health advice. Because I think now it feels like those things are segmented. We don't read about them in one publication, but that was the nature of, Comstock hated doctors. He hated progressive doctors and went after many of them.
Yeah. So our last question is from Karen, who is asking, did private citizens also report to Comstock? Like, did they narc on their fellow citizens?
Yes, again, it's very complicated, but members of the society, the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, were able at various points to make arrests themselves. This is another thing we find so shocking, is that it was a privately incorporated society that had police power. And and just in terms of reporting, absolutely, he got tips all the time. And if anyone's interested, his arrest logs I believe have now been digitized. So you can try Hathett Trust to get them, and they have his meticulous handwriting that he kept from the 1870s until, you can see the last entry before he died. His handwriting's starting to get a little harder to read. But he would talk about his various informants. And he also had these assistants who had their own pseudonyms and decoyed people. Charles Bamberger was one of his assistants, and they would come in disguise and pretend to be people they weren't.
Did he talk about the assumed names that he used when he was?
In some cases, he would say, an associate of mine sent that letter.
Mm-hmm.
in some, he would say decoying is okay because the person was going to do the bad thing that they were going to do anyway.
Mhm.
And this was very, very controversial. All of the liberals who reviled him felt that his methods were illegal, and that it wasn't fair to decoy people. But he did it all the time. I mean, he definitely, you're talking about that Freudian question. He definitely was a sadist. Was he a masochist sadist? I don't know. He loved surprising people. And then at the same time, like after Ida Craddock died, he went to the Brooklyn Philosophical Society, might have been the Brooklyn Philosophical Association in Williamsburg, to totally get shouted down by all her friends who said that he had worried her to death. So here's a guy who didn't shy away from being hated. And I found that kind of interesting, that I think that he had a compulsive need for attention. Why would any rational person want to be in a room full of people who hated them? Well, if you get off on your own power, and you like to be the center of attention, maybe you do.
Woo. Woo. Yep. Well,
did we get to the bottom? I'm glad that people are talking about all of these different landmarks.
Yes. And I've been collecting a bunch of links as you've been talking, Amy. So
that's why I was mentioning my JSTOR article. And
yeah, keep an eye out, everyone, for our follow-up
hi,
email.
Justy. I see some friends.
We're gonna send out a bunch of links in our follow-up email, along with just a short program survey. We always appreciate your time and your feedback to help us improve our programming. So
and please buy the book on bookshop.org if you want to support independent bookstores that have really had a tough 16 months.
Yes, or buy it at your local bookstore. Here's the link again. Amy, thank you so much. What an absolutely delightful talk.
Thank you, everyone, for being here.
A window into a truly wild and essential piece of history. So we will keep the spirit of Sanger and Goldman and all of those who were fighting for all of the things and take good care. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. Buy the book. We hope to see you again at an event sometime soon. Have a good evening,
Thank you so much,
everyone.
Ariel. Good night,
Take care. Good night.